Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming September of 2017 premiere auction. And today we're taking a look at a British Lanchester submachine gun. Now let's set the stage properly. It is 1939. Germany has invaded Poland. Germany then invades a bunch of other countries, and then France, and then we have the evacuation from Dunkirk, and things are looking pretty bleak for the British. Now, the British had gone into World War II without having any of what they called gangster guns in their military inventory. They had not a single submachine gun in 1939, and that was just fine because they had all of the other standard arms of the British Army. However, in 1939 and 1940, it very quickly became apparent that the submachine gun was a very valuable tool in the modern military arsenal, and not having one was a serious problem for the British. So they instituted an emergency program to come up with some sort of submachine gun. Now, the first solution to this was an easy one. Let's just buy Thompson guns from the United States. So they proceeded to start doing that. The Thompson was a pretty expensive gun. We're talking about something like $200 or $220 at the time. That would translate into something like 50 pounds sterling at the time. That was a ton of money. The British were paying for these things with gold bullion reserves, and they were going to be needing that money for a lot of other things. And the Thompson was not the most efficient use of it. So started looking for other solutions. And one that presented itself was a pair of captured German MP28 submachine guns out of Ethiopia that were brought back to the UK and reverse engineered. So the Lanchester itself comes from the reverse engineering of an MP28 by a guy named George Lanchester for the Sterling Engineering Company. Of course, better known for its Sterling submachine guns late and after World War II. But for the time being, Sterling would be the prime manufacturer of the Lanchester submachine gun. And this really is a slightly modified but mechanically identical copy of the MP28. Once the plans were set up to begin manufacturing the Lanchester, the next question was, how many do we need? So there was some consultation with the different branches of the British Armed Forces, and well, the British Navy was quite interested in these. They wanted them for shipboard guns, for boarding parties, Royal Marines, that sort of thing. The Air Force was also interested in them. They wanted them for guarding airfields. The Army, however, was not interested in them. The Army decided that it was pretty happy with the Thompson guns that it had. Now, that would prove to be a poor decision in the long run, but that's what they decided at the time. So an initial order was placed for 50,000 Lanchesters. They were to be divided basically 50-50 between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. This was actually later bumped up to 80,000. And in total, just under 80,000 of these guns were made by 1943. So production began in 41, ran until roughly midpoint of 1943. And interestingly, partway through, the Royal Air Corps actually decided, never mind, we don't want them anymore. They had found a different option, which was Smith & Wesson light rifles. So 9mm, basically semi-auto submachine guns from Smith & Wesson that were, I guess, cheaper, or maybe they were going to be available more quickly. That turned out to be a really bad decision, as those guns were basically so bad that most of them were thrown in the ocean. The upshot being that the Royal Navy ended up with the vast majority of the Lanchesters that were produced. Now, I mentioned these ran until 1943. That's because once you've got it in production, and it's a commercial contract with Sterling, and then eventually with a couple other companies, including Greener and a company called Boss, once it's in production, the production is going to finish. So even though by the middle of 1941, the early versions of the Sten gun had been adopted, and those were going to go to the Army, the Lanchester would stay in production for a couple years. Now, there was an early Mark I version, and only a couple thousand of those were made before they pretty quickly transitioned to the Mark I Star. One interesting side note, Shepard and Turpin, the two guys who were behind the Sten gun, actually developed plans for a Mark II Lanchester that would be more simplified than this, but that was never adopted. The military only adopted part of it, namely the conversion of the trigger mechanisms. So, as originally developed, the Mark I Lanchester had a semi-auto selector switch, so you could fire this in either semi or full auto mode. That was scrapped when they went to the Mark I Star. In fact, it was scrapped a little bit before the Mark I Star. This, for example, is a Mark I gun that is full auto only. It was built with some Mark I Star parts. There were a couple other changes made to the actual design of the gun in that transition. And actually, why don't we go ahead and take a look at those right now. The similarities between the Lanchester down here and the MP28 here are, well, pretty obvious. We have the same perforated barrel jackets. We have the same design feature of a turned receiver tube that has a magazine well fitted over the top of it, bolt on the side. We have the safety notches here, the same exact disassembly mechanism where both guns pivot around this front screw point to open. The British have a different locking catch than the Germans did. The British had a different fire selector system, but with the exception of a few little details like that, these guns are mechanically basically identical. I'll show you a comparison of the internals when we take them apart as well. A few things to point out here. The Lanchester does include a bayonet lug, not a typical thing on submachine guns, but a few people did it. The Japanese did it, and the British did it with the Lanchester. So this fits the standard 1907 pattern Lee Enfield bayonet. I should point out this gun is coming up for sale at Rock Island. It does not include the bayonet. I pulled a bayonet off of another gun just to show you the fitting there. One of the more distinctive features of the Lanchester is its brass magazine well. This is, of course, a separate unit, a separate part that slides over the receiver tube and is mounted in place on the MP28 design as well as the Lanchester. So it was not difficult to make this out of a different material than the receiver. And I believe it was done just because it was easier to cast brass at that time, or under those circumstances, than steel. And this is a relatively complex part, so it is something that you would want to cast, most likely. On the top of that magazine well are the markings on the gun. These look like they're pretty cheesy electro-pencil sort of markings, and that's true. That's exactly how these were actually done. So you'll note that this is a Mark I gun, does not have the star. Serial number is relatively low. That A suffix on the serial number indicates that this is a gun which can only be repaired with hand-fitted parts. So Lanchesters were not manufactured with any necessary guarantee of parts interchangeability. And if you wanted something like a new extractor, because extractors did actually kind of tend to break on these, that was one of the relatively few problems they had, you would have to make sure that it was hand-fitted. It might just drop in, but you weren't guaranteed that. One of the specific features of the Mark I early Lanchesters is this tangent sight going out to 600 yards. This would be replaced by a two-position flip sight that would be 100 and 200, not that much later on in production. And the buttstock is another relatively distinctive feature of the Lanchester. It's got the same kind of hook wrist as the SMLE rifle, and the same brass butt plate as well, with a cleaning kit trap in it. So rather than copy the exact profile of the MP28 stock, well, let's just use what everyone's used to and what we already have tooling to manufacture, and that would be an SMLE buttstock. Now, it's not actually an SMLE buttstock. It is a one-piece stock that comes all the way up here, and it's actually a quite heavy-duty handguard at the front, but the tooling and the profile are the exact same. The disassembly catch here is one of the parts that definitely differs from the MP28 design. So to take this apart, we're just going to rotate this 90 degrees clockwise, like that. Then, as with the 28, the action pivots up away from the stock and allows you access to all the internal parts. As with the 28, we're going to rotate this cap slightly counterclockwise to remove it. And then out comes the recoil spring and the bolt. Here we have our Lanchester internals and a set of MP28 internals. This is actually not a great example of a Lanchester bolt because this is in fact a modified Sten bolt that has been used in lieu of the original MP28 style bolt. So the MP28 has a separate striker and the Lanchester copied that. This bolt, however, is a Sten bolt, which is better practically in several ways. It has a much stronger extractor to it. The Lanchester extractor was really kind of the one weak point of the gun. It tended to break. And this has a fixed firing pin, and which it makes it a little simpler to manufacture than the two-part bolt of the MP28. So the Lanchester would have originally had this style of bolt. This one has been retrofitted and in a practical matter upgraded with a Sten bolt. The trigger mechanism of the Lanchester, in full auto at least, is actually still basically a copy of the MP18 or the MP28, where we have the trigger pushes a bar forward, which retracts a sear catch right here, and when the sear comes down, the bolt is free to travel forward and fire. Now the full auto version of this, or the semi-auto version of this, was substantially different from the MP28 and a little simpler, but that full auto version, that semi-auto selector switch was very quickly removed from the design because it was unnecessary. This fires at about 600 rounds per minute or a little slower, and it's actually pretty simple to fire single shots with a Lanchester. So not only did they stop manufacturing the semi-auto switch, which by the way was sitting out here at the front of the trigger guard, they actually took all of the semi-auto parts out of the parts catalog and retrofitted, well, made it very difficult for anyone to retrofit semi-auto back onto the guns. So as far as I can tell, this is sort of a transitional example made with a mixture of parts, because this particular gun has a Mark I star trigger group in it, but it does have the early Mark I sight, and it is marked as a Mark I. I think it's also worth pointing out some of the simplifications that were done with the Lanchester. While it is a mechanical copy of the MP28, there were some improvements that were made. Things like the whole trigger group being a self-contained unit that then is welded to the magazine tube. On the MP28, there was a separate trigger housing and trigger guard. The trigger was pinned into a metal piece in the stock. That requires a lot more time and a lot more fitting to make everything work right. When you've got a self-contained unit like this that's permanently attached to the receiver, it's much quicker and easier to get it all assembled. You'll also notice the rather terrible looking welds. You know what, they may not look super pretty, they may not be ground down, but and in this case, they are hiding under the wood stock. But that does the job. That trigger housing is not falling off of this gun. We can see the same sort of thing here with the rear sight. It's actually screwed in place and then welded over the top of the screws, both at the front and at the back. This was the beginning of the war. This was a very bleak looking period for the British Isles, and there was a lot of very serious speculation that Germany would literally be invading any month. And it was a lot more important to have a gun that worked than have a gun that looked nice and pretty. Now the magazines for the Lanchester are identical in function to the Sten gun magazine. They are a double stack, single feed design. This is copied from the MP28. However, the Lanchester magazines were made in 32 and 50 round varieties, and this is one of the 50 round magazines. This is one of the very few examples out there of an actual military production submachine gun stick magazine of more than about 30 rounds capacity. This thing is huge and awkward and unwieldy, but the Royal Navy wanted them, and I guess on a ship, maybe it makes sense. Clearly, they worked well enough that these magazines stayed in service as well. The guns were, of course, used with Sten gun magazines from time to time because those were available in very large numbers once production got going. But you know what? This most of the time is going to work. It has the same downsides as a typical Sten gun magazine, namely feed reliability because of that single feed design. The feed lips have a tendency to get a little bit bent from time to time, which can change the feed angle, which can cause malfunctions. But in general, that 50 round mag worked. Looking at it overall, the Lanchester is a relatively heavy gun. It's still, while it's cheaper than the Thompson, it's still a first generation submachine gun, just one that was made as quickly as possible. So it still has a lot of machine-turned components, obviously that big cast magazine well, and it was still too expensive. So that's why the Sten would take over and be produced in far larger numbers than the Lanchester. This weighs about 12 pounds, little under 12 pounds, about 5.4 kilograms. Has a relatively reasonable rate of fire, something like 550 or 600 rounds per minute. And between that and the weight, it's quite controllable. It's heavy to carry, but then again, it was largely, well, primarily used by the Royal Navy. So some Royal Marines would have to tote these things around, but a lot of them were on ships, and they'd sit in the arms locker or sit chained to the deck, and not the sort of thing you had to hump for dozens of miles at a time. So the Lanchesters served pretty well for the British, well enough that they were maintained in inventory until the early 1970s by the Royal Navy, and they were also used by a whole bunch of other countries around the world. Interestingly, it appears one of the main ways that these things actually got out to other countries, some were sold, but a lot of them were actually on British naval vessels. They were part of the equipment for the ship. Now, this would be for preventing enemy boarding parties and that sort of thing. And when the British were surplusing naval vessels off and selling them to other countries, they were selling them complete, everything down to the kitchen silverware, apparently. And that included Lanchester submachine guns in the ship's armories. So a lot of countries that bought a few ships from the British ended up getting Lanchesters with them. So you'll still see them in service in some places around the world, even today. If you'd like to have this one in service in your own gun collection, it is coming up for sale here at Rock Island. It is a fully transferable, registered Mark I, I would say a Mark I transitional submachine gun. So if you take a look at the description text below, you'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page on this guy. You can take a look at their pictures and description and their estimated pricing and all the other good stuff there. And if it's something that you can't live without, well, you can come participate in the auction live, or you can place a bid over the phone or through their website. Thanks for watching.